Thank you for joining me today. So the first question, this obligatory question I ask to all my guests, that where were you born and raised?
I was born in St Andrews and raised in Kirkcaldy in Fife. So very much a Fifer. And
Mm,
from there, I've always been really mostly lived and worked on the east coast of Scotland, either in Edinburgh or in
mm.
Dundee, with a 10-year gap where I was living in Canada.
Wow, okay. Any earliest memories growing up in Kirkcaldy?
Oh, earliest memories. Oh, surely, well, I wonder, obviously, the usual kind of school type memories, but then also, I think, given the season that they've just had, the joys of supporting Wraith Rovers over the early days, aside pushing for promotion at the moment, but they were always early memories, freezing in the terraces
Mm,
watching Wraith Rovers. So that's also an abiding memory of Kirkcaldy. And also, I guess the Links Market is famous for that. So the fairground that came usually around Easter time every year and was reputed to be the longest fairground in Europe.
mm,
Uh, oh, those are always memories of Kirkcaldy that are still strong, still going on, traditions that are still going on.
mm. This is a kind of beautiful seaside, isn't it?
Rarely described as a beautiful seaside, but it's certainly on the coast. It's got a harbour. It's for the economists in the room. It's a home to Adam Smith
Yeah.
is very much part of Kirkcaldy, and Adam Smith Theatre has been a major part of the cultural scene, and then also what used to be Fife Tech, Fife College, St
Mm,
Andrew, Adam Smith College as well now. Adam Smith University. It has that link there. So it's very much been a working harbour, and then a strong promenade area, and
mm,
then also it was certainly right through to probably the 90s. It was well known for the coal mining area, so deep sea,
mm.
undersea. Coal mining going around just at the Fife coalfields were very much part of the Kirkcaldy identity.
Okay. Did you have any memories about those coal industry, coal mining?
I guess it was always there in the sense that it was what was there above ground at Seafield was the pit, and the mining machinery was always there above ground. We never really saw much activity as such because it all went underground and right out under the Forth.
Mm,
But yeah, it was always a big feature, and it certainly sustained the economy in Kirkcaldy. It had a strong, I guess, mining-based economy as well as community. And
mm,
when that died down, then it was the economy shifted a little bit to more some of the electronics industries that were developing in nearby Glenrothes in the
mm,
1960s and
mm,
70s, and they took over by the 80s. So that sort of Silicon Glen idea, which is
mm,
something that was part of nearby
mm.
in terms of Glenrothes. So the influence of Kirkcaldy kind of waned, and Glenrothes as the administrative centre and also employment centre started to take off as you moved from the 60s into the 90s.
Mm, mm. So, like, looking back, I mean, so it's like another pertinent question. Like, how do you find your parents, like their role in, like shaping your understanding about, the things Scotland, or there's like, any kind of political consciousness you are thinking?
Not especially. No, it wasn't really a political family as such. So I guess that identity
Mm,
or awareness of the political scene developed more at university in my case in terms
mm,
of experiencing what would then seem like a big university, Edinburgh University, although it was dwarfed by the size it has now become.
mm,
But yeah, I
mm,
think, but also the period through the 80s and 90s, there was a big political changes in how Scotland was looking to govern itself. So I don't have any memories of the 79 referendum on devolution, but certainly as that
mm,
moved through the 80s and early 90s and the and the move for the Constitutional Convention, then there was an awful lot going on, and the newspapers were dominated by it. So that kind of political consciousness or political awareness was really becoming quite dominant, and I suppose that coincided with my university years.
So, like, when did you decide that you want to be a historian?
Well, I suppose my degree was always, I enjoyed history at school, but I also enjoyed what was then called modern studies. So that was a politics light. And so I always combined the two of history and modern studies. And when I went to university, then I moved away from politics. I moved into sociology. So I have a joint degree in sociology and economic and social history. So I always did the two together. And the same with my PhD, although strictly speaking, my PhD is actually in sociology. But it was always historical work that I did. So I liked historical evidence, but I liked the sociological approach.
Do you mind giving some idea about your PhD thesis? Like what kind of subject area, like any specific?
The PhD thesis came about from a kind of interest in historical development of the middle classes in urban Scotland, influenced very much by a growing literature on middle class formation that was going on there. So historically, or in historiographical terms, so much had been done on working class history since the 60s right through to the 80s. By the 80s, there was a realization there was a gap in understanding middle class formation. So I very much looked to investigate the bourgeoisie, and I combined that with an interest in nationalism, because for many in the 80s and 90s, there's a famous book by Tom Nairn called The Breakup of Britain, which was incredibly influential, came out in various forms in the late 70s, and then the best-selling edition was in 1981, and that very much looked at the historical development of nationalism in Scotland and effectively blamed the middle classes for this kind of missing nationalism in the 19th century. So I was interested in exploring that particular point. To what extent was Scotland experiencing a missing nationalism, particularly in the 19th century, that Nairn focuses on, and what role the middle class is in it? So my thesis was investigating that, and I looked to see the form of nationalism that did exist in this period before formal political organisations came about. So there was one very nascent political organisation called the National Association for the Vindication of Scottish Rights, not the most catchy of titles. It only existed for a short period in the 1850s, but Scotland missed out the 1848 period of revolution. It kind of it more or less missed out the 1790s as well, but certainly missed out the 1848, but had this one middle class based political organization. There was a mixture of liberal, conservative, I mean, a lot of conservative, also liberal, and some radical political adherents were involved in it. So I was interested in that particular organization, and I looked to see what kind of nationalism that it developed, and then how did that reflect Scotland's position in union in the middle of the 19th century. So I tried to look at the form of governance that Scotland experienced in mid-19th century as a period of strong local government. Also, very much in Scotland's case, the independence of its civil society. So I looked, effectively looking at one form of nationalism, how that developed, what was the rhetoric around it, and then looking at the sociological structures that underpinned it, and that's what took me to an analysis of civil society, not just church law and education, but looking at all the voluntary organisations and philanthropic societies that were intervening and governing Scotland. So I looked at how Scotland was governed, how its nationalism formed, and put the two together, and that was to try and provide some form of challenge to Tom Nairn's idea that there was a missing nationalism, that nationalism should have formed a particular pathway, and I was arguing how it formed a pathway that was consistent with the form of governance that was going on. So that was effectively what my PhD was about.
Because I actually never thought about it, this like Scotland's middle class, their role in politics, like how these things were like in forming that. what you were
Well,
saying in
well,
the 19th
well,
century.
absolutely. If you think politically, it's only the middle classes who got the vote in 1832.
Mm,
So it's different legislation in England as there
okay.
is from Scotland. The middle classes, so the £10 property holders are the ones,
Mm,
and they're men, so it's men of property and education who've got the vote. And
mm,
you've got that right through, that's right through to the Second Reform Act in the 1860s and the third again in the 1880s. So you've got a slow expansion of the franchise, but effectively it's middle class dominated, and that you're talking about 10% of the population of the having the vote. So in that sense, it leads a focus to the middle classes, but you've also got to look for non-political, non-parliamentary political forms of activity to
mm,
understand both governance and the sense of national identity. Because with such a small franchise, it's no surprise there's a lack of a political body that's
mm,
carrying national sentiment. Is more likely to be expressed in other ways, other forms, other non-directly parliamentary political activities. So small p politics is kind of what I was interested in, and again that
mm,
speaks to the sociological underpinnings of that identity.
mm. Like one more question on your PhD thesis. Like what kind of industries this middle class are from? Like,
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's kind of classic, and it kind of fits with other European nationalisms in that they were the leader was effectively a historical novelist, so the kind of cultural elite was there. The guy was ex-British military, had a period as an ex-serviceman in Canada, but came back. A guy called James Grant, but came back, tried out the army again, didn't like it, and ended up becoming a historical novelist, but wrote about historical military adventures, so
mm,
kind of romantic and military adventures, and got very obsessed with issues of heraldry and things like that. But
mm,
otherwise, they had a mixture. They had conservative leadership in there. They were quite small c conservative in terms of
mm,
traditional issues, but they complained about not breaking the Union of 1707, but they wanted equality under the Union. So
mm,
they again the kind of things we still see today about why is all that public spending happening in England and not in
mm,
Scotland? So looking at
mm,
proportion of public spending. Uh, but back to your question, though, they had that kind of cultural lead. They didn't. They were never seen as the first rank politicians.
mm,
Gladstone gave lip service to this idea eventually of home rule for Scotland. He was very careful not to upset the opportunity for bringing home rule into Ireland. So
mm,
for Gladstone, kind of paid lip service to the Scottish nationalists, saying, yeah, of course, I believe in some form of home rule for Scotland, more power to the local governments. Yeah, that's of course I believe that, but never follow
mm,
through. And so, by the time you get to the 1885 into the 1890s, then you get the Scottish Home Rule Association, which again a much more kind of political protest group as we understand it today.
mm,
And that came from that failure to get a parliamentary political
mm,
impetus behind that kind of more cultural nationalism that developed in the 1850s. But these were guys that didn't want to break the union. They wanted Scotland to be better governed under the union. They wanted greater equality under the union. They felt that the union happened because of an agreement. In
mm,
1707, two sides came together. They established themselves as equals in their
mm,
mind, and therefore that's how they wanted Scotland to progress further forward, given the overarching influence of empire. They wanted Scotland to be equal with England within that empire. So it was a more perhaps a more complex form of nationalism than we understand today, but one very much of its time and linked into that form of governance that I was describing earlier.
mm, mm. Because I myself like involved in this like decolonization politics and other things. But I'm like more focusing on like Middle East and all those areas.
Mhm.
Um, in terms of like um, the things you're talking about, after the union. So when they're pushing for this equality and other things, does it mean it's like Scotland? That's the starting point. They were also getting involved in British Empire and that kind of area as well. as a kind of gift.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's one of my favourite examples was when they laid the foundation stone to the Scott Monument in Edinburgh. So Walter
Mm,
Scott was being commemorated. He died in 1832, and in 1844, I think it's when they laid the foundation stone and put a time capsule underneath. And basically, they argue Walter Scott is Scotland's greatest ever novelist, but he's second only to William Shakespeare. So they kind of made the argument that Scotland first, but still a kind of little brother to England in some regards. But there was a sense of a growing sense of a Scottish political agenda, that's for sure. And politically, the dominance of the Liberal Party in 19th century Scotland, particularly in the towns, is quite is sufficiently distinct from what was going on in England
mm, mm,
and Wales and Ireland as well, Northern Ireland as well. So there is a growing sense of a political agenda. There's a dominance coming out of Edinburgh. So the legal elites were very much part of that political grouping. So you can
mm,
see the court, the medics, the courts, the political elite coming out of Edinburgh, as well as the Church of Scotland as being part of Scotland's self-governing
mm, mm,
sense of difference. So there was a strong cultural sense.
mm,
Uh, but politically, they were very much tied to empire in a way that we perhaps don't understand or don't appreciate today.
mm,
And I think it's interesting that only now are we beginning to kind of deconstruct some of that engagement with empire, engagement with settlement in
mm,
different parts of the empire, and indigenous encounters as well. We're beginning to see these as not as part of a more challenging history, perhaps a more uncomfortable history of Scotland's engagement with different parts of the empire. There's often a
mm,
sense of Scotland were the good settlers, the good imperialists compared to the English
mm,
imperialists, but
mm,
there's that evidence, that evidence is increasingly under challenge, or that argument is increasingly under challenge.
mm, mm. So like from there, like if you come back to this like modern day Scottish nationalism and Scottish
Mm.
politics, um, I mean, what could be the starting point if you want to talk about contemporary Scottish politics?
Well, I'm not sure what the starting point would be nowadays. I used to joke that when I studied Scottish nationalism, it was all about why there would not be a Scottish Parliament, and now it's there's a Scottish Parliament in 1999, right? It's re-established. Okay, so let's recalibrate how we interpret the kind of historical trajectory. So
Mm,
I guess you go back to the creation of the Parliament nowadays, and then go back to the referendum of 2014 and see
mm,
how that plays out. I think there's what is dramatically different in recent years, and I think there's some recent newspaper coverage on this. Is the SNP no longer a protest party, but of course a
mm,
party of government, a party in government for such a long period
mm,
of time,
mm,
and that's really changed perspectives. I think because no longer is it, because often some of the theory on nationalism is
mm,
based around it being a protest, wanting something.
mm,
Nationalist groups around the world are wanting something from another political body. And the SNP, of course, still does want independence. So that hasn't changed. But what has changed is the SNP is dominance of so many of the constituencies, local government, as well as centralisation
mm,
around Holyrood.
mm,
One of the objections in the 19th century was centralisation of administration in London. The
mm,
Scottish local authorities wanted to have their own independence, just as
mm,
places like Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool wanted their own independence to govern as they wished in the 19th century. Local
mm,
government was king, but now we see a difference. We see local government here having less funding, less independence, and was much more centralisation around what goes on in Holyrood. So
mm,
some of the kind of balance between local Scottish government and Westminster have certainly changed
mm,
from different historical periods.
mm, mm. I mean, I'm not sure. Like, I mean, in like 2014, like I still have the memory of the Scottish independence. this like vote referendum. Were you in UK during that time, or were you in Canada?
Yeah, I just returned. I just
Okay.
come back the year before,
Mm,
and it was interesting seeing the shift from previous strong Labour supporters into SNP
mm,
supporters. That was quite interesting. Certainly around Dundee, yes, City,
mm,
you could see that, and I think there was, and I think I saw that amongst the students. There was a sense of, oh, we weren't going to vote yes, and then that changed. I think as the campaign went on, so there were students I think I found were more expressive of a yes vote.
mm,
So I think that was an interesting change, and but also I think there's some of the debate about whether it's this form of civic nationalism, was it a peaceful debate, was there violence, was there aggression, was there intimidation? Well, again,
mm,
you look over the IDC, it certainly doesn't compare, but there certainly was. I think people in both sides expressed discomfort about how the campaign was panned out. But
mm,
but then as a academic, it was great to see the level of debate that was going on and the
mm,
engagement of people with different either financial bodies or welfare bodies or social care bodies, all debating what governing would look like in a potentially independent Scotland or not. So in terms of engaging civil society, I think, which had developed in the 80s, I think it
mm,
really was rose to a new level again in the 2014 referendum.
mm, mm. It's like I remember like one of my students, she was big in Scottish politics and SNP. I mean, her father is an MP, still MP, was an MP. And she was telling her story. She was a very young girl, like growing up in somewhere in Glasgow. And her memories, like, as 13, 14 years old, this generation were like really looking for, absolute that we are becoming an independent Scotland. And she
Yeah.
was telling her story the night they knew that, they didn't get it. And she totally broke down, absolutely broke down. So that
Yeah.
was her memory, and then how the parents tried to comfort her.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting because and that was one of the differences. The voting age was reduced to 16. The level of younger people
Mm,
engaged in the debate was quite dramatic, and the influence in the school debate within the schools as well was certainly significant. So there is a and I'll leave that to you political scientists to work out about the age profile, the voting difference across the ages. I'm also slightly conscious of when I was working in Canada, I dealt a lot with clan groups, Scottish cultural groups, diaspora groups, and the generation I was mainly dealing with were relatively advanced in age, and a lot of them had emigrated in the 50s and 60s,
mm,
and they were very much in the no camp supporting union,
mm,
and that changed. I know more recent research has been carried out on younger generations of hyphenated Scots in the diaspora, and there is a growing support there for some form for independence.
mm,
Whether that's again politics, as you know, changes very quickly, and whether that's still the
mm.
case now, given the
Yeah.
travails with the SNP, it'll be interesting to see.
Mm,
But no, and I have seen some studies done by the Centre for Constitutional Change at Edinburgh University, which has been looking at kind of the interrelationship of the devolution of the independence vote and Brexit, for example,
mm,
and looking at also sort of gender and age divisions within that vote. So there's a lot there to keep the political scientists busy in that
mm,
kind of work. But historically, it's interesting that there is still uh, a debate, and there has been a debate about the role of the Scottish government, the SNP Scottish government, in promoting different versions of history,
mm,
different versions in the history curriculum to see and whether that did become quite a live debate around about the 2014 vote. about what kind of history should be taught, and what topics and what timelines effectively
Mm,
should be taught. So history is still very much alive, and it's in terms of those political debates. So, and it's good to see that historical understanding is still playing its part in
mm,
these in sort of political decision making.
mm. Because like you had like almost kind of authority about Scottish politics during that time. What were you predicting? Like, were you, because I mean, from my political science background, I thought that Scotland is still not ready for the independence. But at the same time, I thought that that was the best ever opportunity.
It probably was the best ever opportunity in the strength of Alex Salmond in those
Mm,
days, with a very strong understudy, as it were, and Nicola Sturgeon. I was in those days very much a strong team. It coincided with the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Bannockburn. So you had Scotland's greatest victory historically,
mm,
1314 to 2014. You also had 2014 homecoming. So again, the diaspora was engaged to talk about all things Scotland. Because so you had homecoming, commemoration of the Battle of Bannockburn, and you had and the Ryder Cup, and you had the referendum. So in the sense of the cultural planets were all aligning in that sense, as well as having a strong politically efficient SNP
mm,
who were really, I think, quite dominant over the political agenda,
mm,
and the media as well, I think. And uh, so was it the best opportunity? I think certainly it was, and I think I understand the story you told earlier about the great disappointment, because it looked like it was going to happen. But it's hard to say. The idea is Scotland ready? It's a tricky one, and I read a recent article by dear old Neil Asherson, who was very active in the 70s and 80s, a great political commentator, former editor of The Independent, but very much he was a cultural leader on these debates in the 80s and 90s. And he was saying, well, it doesn't come down to pounds or economics. It comes down to he's much more about the sort of the nationalist feelings about whether it's your gut that decides whether you vote for independence or not. You don't make that decision based on whether you think you'll be £100 a year better off or not. You vote whether you think it's right for you as a nation. So that was the piece he was making. But I think there's a growing since then, and given the turmoil of Brexit, COVID as well, I think
mm,
there's probably even there was a realization in 2014, and I think it's increased over time since then because of these major global events, that the sort of breaking off that union with England, that market that's there, that economic, social, familial interchange between Scotland and England, breaking that would be tricky, would be unwelcome for many. So I don't think the vote for independence has changed too much. I think it's gone down a little bit, but I don't think it's not showing consistently over 50%. I think it's still around the 40s, 45
mm,
as it achieved in 2014. So I think, but it's if there were another referendum tomorrow, I don't think the yes vote would be as strong.
mm,
But as 5, 10 years, maybe something will
mm,
come back. But that the COVID, the Brexit, I think those shocks and the wars that are going on elsewhere around Europe, I think those have shaken a lot of people willingness to take a jump into potentially the unknown. They're much more perhaps more small c conservative in that regard. But again, I leave that to political scientists, not the
mm.
historians, to work out.
um, I mean, the way I see it, I'm not much in Scottish politics. It's just like recently I got interested because I've been overwhelmed with like other politics throughout my career.
Of
um,
course.
uh, but I mean, at the same time, because I mean, the more I see Scottish politics, the more I feel that is when you talk about nationalism or independence is always very much linked with this one party. I mean, so the well-being of
Well,
this one party is kind of linked with that aspiration.
it's interesting, isn't it, that so the SNP is now the carrier of nationalism when it
Mm,
never used to be.
mm,
And even yeah, so you can argue, and the other political parties do argue that they are Scotland first. They are for the Scottish nation. So there are separate political parties: Scottish Labour and the Liberal Dem, and of course Conservative and Unionist Party. So they are, in that sense, distinct. And that was certainly a feature historically, where all the political parties would be involved in expressing some sense of Scotland first. So, and one of the things that sociologists have been interested in is that development of a Scottish political agenda that was distinct from England. Are there any socioeconomic underpinnings that would explain why that would be? And even looking at attitude surveys, for example, shows there's not a great deal of difference between Scotland and England in terms of main social attitudes, although there is obviously a socioeconomic, there's an economic difference more than anything in terms of the size of the public sector employment, for example, north and south of the border. So there are these sociological underpinnings to help explain why there may be voting difference, but then there's also the Scottish card, as it can be called, to say, well, well, how do you solve this? Well, nationalism, putting it into framing it under Scotland, framing any issue under a national or a nationalist banner or category, that helps to mobilize support around a particular social issue or how to solve it. So there is a nationalist agenda that can be called up, and
mm,
and you're right that's dominated by the SNP and the push for independence. But you can argue, and I suspect the other parties would do, that they're all about governing for Scotland and the people of Scotland first. So in that sense, they are pushing a national agenda, and in terms of language, it's whether that gets categorised as a nationalist agenda as well.
mm,
So it's interesting. The SNP is always the Scottish National Party,
mm.
and politicians like Gordon Brown used to wind them up by calling them the Scottish Nationalist Party. So, but it is because it's about nationalism, whereas they'd
Mm,
rather promote themselves as the Scottish nation, but then so would, I suspect, the other parties.
mm, mm. Like, I mean, tell us a bit more about this, like this Scottish Parliament and Westminster, and how these like two things. Like, I mean, in terms of like my understanding is like the idea about self-determination. When you feel like totally equal in every way, there's always a good chance that things will be as it is. Like in my case, like I was born in Bangladesh, so Bangladesh got separated from like Pakistan because it didn't work out because of the power relation.
Yeah,
So suddenly Bangladesh, like Bengalis thought that this is not good. It's like they are the winner and they are taking everything away from us.
yeah,
Um, so so these two structure like Hollywood, they have power, but also they have got people in the Westminster as well. But it looks like the Scottish independence, these aspirations, this is not good enough. Perhaps like I mean, is there anything like good enough so that we can?
yeah. Well, I think increasingly there's the argument that the answer is always no. It's never
Mm,
good enough until independence. So and you can see the increasing powers of Holyrood since it was set up in 1999. So that it has increased its powers. It's you can see that in the tax system, for example, that used
mm,
that control over tax variation has increased. So and then control over issues like health, and we saw that during the COVID years as well, about how uh, Scotland was operating separately in ways it was operating separately from the rest of the UK.
mm,
Uh, so the idea of the two parliaments, I think there's it's the old Canadian adage from Pierre Trudeau about being in bed with an elephant. You know, yeah, you might get on very well sleeping next to an elephant, but as soon as the elephant turns, you're going to know about it. And so that's Canadians next door to the USA and Scotland next door to England. That analogy has been used in the past. So the bigger partner is always going to have that kind of undue influence on Scotland, whether intentional or not. But yeah, what has rarely happened is Holyrood being governed by the same political party as is in position in power in the rest of the UK. It happened for a period after the 1997 election of Labour. And they had a Labour leadership in Scotland as well. But so it was interesting, that period of kind of working together compared to what before and after, which is after rather, which is very much the one of opposition. So it'll be interesting to see if Labour wins the next general election, what's going to be the balance in Holyrood, and whether if Labour is very low in terms of number of seats at the moment, but if it were to get the majority or lead a minority government, it'd be interesting to see how that works, or if the SNP is again either the minority has a minority government, how that again it changes now with a Labour government as opposed to a Conservative one. So those tensions are interesting, and there are increasing arguments both in Scotland and Wales from those that argue devolution has failed. It hasn't worked. It gets too much independence. You're getting too much overlap. You're getting too much inconsistency across the UK. So there are voices that argue against devolution as a principle, but then there are others, as I said earlier, who always see it as it's never quite enough. That if there's a problem, the problem can only be solved by further expansion of to then independence. Although that then leads to the other big question, beloved of political scientists: is there any other? Is there independence? What does it mean? Is there a nation state any longer when so many other large economic and other political unions exist out there that people are part of? The power of the central bank, for example, in Europe, is one not to be forgotten.
I've been reading some interesting stuff, like in terms of Middle East politics. Like we are seeing like a bunch of countries now coming out in the world system. These are not like centrally controlled, like full control of their own state. Like for example, places like Syria or like Somalia or like Yemen or even like Iraq, Afghanistan. There is a central government there, but they don't have the full control of the country. The part of the country actually just run by itself. I don't know how it works, but we are seeing like this kind of post-centralized government state in the system. But it looks like these countries can survive, and those smaller entities can also survive. So that's kind of interesting development in what we are saying. The demise of the state, this Westphalian state.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's various political parties, of course, call for a smaller state, and I think there are issues. I don't think anyone would say, no one would say Scotland would not survive if it were independent. I think there's the debate then is, how long would it take to get, if there's any kind of lull about getting back on its feet, prospering, developing, as well. That's a kind of economic instrumental argument, although there's always still the kind of psychological, but also sense of, well, Scotland should be independent anyway. So there's those sort of arguments. But with Scotland, again, I guess, like the examples you gave, it's about how much influence might those outside agencies or outside partnerships or governance from elsewhere, how much influence that might have. So for Scotland's economy, for example, given the level of debt per head of the population already, what independence, how much borrowing would Scotland then need to have, and what influence would, from whoever gave that borrowing, what would that have over Scotland's economic policies for generations to come? There's issues like that some people care about, some people don't. Some people just say independence, that's the end of it. Other people will look, well, what would that actually mean in terms of
mm,
different employment sectors, for example? Would it lead to a flight of capital? Would it lead to a
mm,
brain drain? And all these kinds of issues are thrown up. Often then they're ideas as being scare stories,
mm,
but I think these these are all the kinds of issues that were debated in 2014, and no doubt would be debated again if there's
mm,
going to be or when there's a next referendum on independence.
mm, mm. Like, I mean, another thing is like in terms of like when I teach international relations, like in terms of like when we talk about China, and there is the like phrase we use like China cannot rise peacefully. So it means like China will not be allowed to rise peacefully. So they have to fight. They have to, so the other parties. So the thing you actually mentioned about this like bigger elephant. So they have to
Mm.
kind of go through this elephant, and whether elephant will be happy about that. So like that kind of scenario, like can you see like in the Scotland situation? Do you think if they get independence, it will be just like peaceful move on? That is Scotland, yeah, and England will be said that okay, that's good, yeah, carry on, we are out.
Well, yeah, there's not, in some sense, yes, and I think there's not likely to be physical violence.
Mm,
In 1950s, we had letter bombing going on, or fire bombing going off, and things like that. A little bit here and there.
mm,
There's not likely to be. I don't think there'll be physical unrest, but I think there'll be uh, whether I think there's evidence. Well, some evidence being put forward that given the higher tax regime that high earners are experiencing in Scotland, there's movement of people. Whether that kind of activity would happen, there might be political debates about who, people, if people do, Scots do move to other parts of the rest of the UK, for example, would they still have the vote in Scotland, or have they lost that right? That's still an issue amongst the
mm,
diaspora, whether they're allowed to have a say on any political decisions. So there'll be these kind of democratic issues as well. But yeah, I, if the 2014 referendum had voted for yes, I think it'd be more a case of we're sorry to see you go,
yeah.
but it will go forward. I
Mm,
think I don't see it as a kind of a social breakdown
mm,
happening.
mm. Like I mean, coming back to this like contemporary politics, I mean, it's one of the reasons I was in touch with you, like because last couple of days is Scotland going through lots of political turbulence, and it seems like it's kind of settling down a bit now. They have the leader. Um, I mean, what was your thought, though you are a historian, but because it's a very, very current event? What were you thinking that, when Hamza Yusuf was saying that, yeah, so he took that risk. What was your assessment like?
The risk of going away from the Greens.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, in a sense, historically, the government was, well, interesting because the Scots Parliament was designed to be kind of coalition government. Uh,
Mm,
it wasn't designed, so I'm told anyway, it wasn't designed for it to be governed by any one single party. So it was meant to be a much more deliberative kind of government. So yeah, I think what was different is that the dominance of identity politics was
mm,
relatively new, but then that's relatively new across much of the Western world as well. I think that was distinctive, but then as I say, many states are dealing with the same issues. Same with the green issue, the having environmental uh, and net zero policies. Again, that was happening all around the world as well. So, in a sense, one would expect that not to be enough to
mm,
break that coalition. But what going back to what I was saying earlier about no longer being a protest party but being a party of governance, and I
mm,
think those issues of governance, whether it be the ferries, for example, or the issues of education in
mm,
particular, then I think we see issues where NHS as well, where perhaps the voters are seeing that the governing of these issues has not been as successful as they might have hoped. So there's issues of governance that are going along, and questions of competence of governance. And I think that as I suppose it's not. I wouldn't say looking at the whole history of the Scottish Parliament. I don't think those issues are desperately new. Those sort of both Labour and Liberal Democrat have been accused of relatively unsuccessful governance of certain issues over the period. So, in that sense, historically, nothing is that dramatic. So, but I think what is very different is in recent years anyway I guess first fallout with Salmond, and then what's happening with Nicola Sturgeon and Peter Murrell. I think those issues are the kind of issues we haven't seen amongst the SNP really since some of the debates in the 1950s. So I think that's some of the fallout in the SNP was there at the beginning, certainly in the 1920s, it was there in the 1950s, but really a remarkably coherently organized political movement since the 70s. So that's been a little bit of a blip, I would say, historically.
Because like the way I see, like, these two like heavyweights, like Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond, like they are out from the scene now. They're at the same time they played such a big role, such a big heavyweight in terms of the Scottish national politics. So it looks like they need to find that charismatic leaders again.
Yeah, well, the one thing with John Swinney is he's been there a long time, as had been Salmond and Sturgeon. They both had long history, and to Sturgeon's credit, she was often referred to the number of elections she herself has fought as a candidate, and had built up a lot of experience of fighting elections compared to the UK political leaders. So both Salmond and Sturgeon have that experience. Swinney's been there a long time as well. Again, he comes with that lineage to him, and I think that will be a strength. I think whether he can build up that charismatic following in the way that Salmond and Sturgeon did is for someone to see. He's kind of been in the shadows, or been a very much a very strong number two for a number of years, and whether that translates into leadership, I think he's got political issues to deal with in the fallout of the investigation into the SNP finances at the moment. So those are issues that will be challenging for whoever. Challenging for Hamza Yusuf, is now challenging for John Swinney to take on. And if that just comes to nothing, then absolutely move on. And I suspect there'll be a revival in SNP fortunes, given the number of years that the SNP has been so dominant in Scotland. That residual support will still be there for many, and I suspect they'll see a bounce back. But if that could be undermined depending on these on the police investigation, as well as people's view on those governing issues of education, ferries, and health service that I mentioned earlier.
Like one of the things, like these political lawsuits. I mean, because these lawsuits drag, isn't it? So like if you talk about Trump, it's still dragging. It can go forever. So I think SNP will also go through the same process. So there'll be no kind of closure very soon.
Oh, and the reporting restrictions in Scotland are so strong that maybe that the one saving grace is there's not a constant commentary, or even more of a commentary. Obviously there is a commentary on it, but there's not more evidence being openly discussed because of the reporting restrictions. But yeah, I think it's a general surprise at how long the investigation has gone on for, and I have no idea when there might be a resolution one way or other to that. But I think one of the features is, given the party discipline of the SNP, which has been pretty remarkable, is how that discipline is beginning to break down now, which is, usually the feature of other political parties, not the SNP. It's usually incredibly tightly run.
Mm. I mean, especially like when I was watching Hamza Yusuf's like last speech when he was resigning. Um, I mean, I found it because I mean he got emotional, and I don't think he took any questions from the journalists because he just totally broke
Oh,
down. It just totally broke down. He just like gone, and he was talking about his personal, emotional, this like stress he's like going through. But also he's the like I think the one of I think he's the youngest Scottish first prime minister.
oh, could well be, yes, of course.
And also he's the first Muslim as well.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about this? Do you think? I mean, how do you judge his that smallest sin in Scottish politics? I'm not seeing him coming back because I think that's a serious departure from this young man.
Yeah, I wonder. I don't know what he would whether he's prepared to come back as an MSP or remain as an MSP and come back in future governments or parliaments. I don't know. I think your instinct is right that he probably will go away, but yeah,
Mm,
you have to he'll be looking out to find himself another career if that's the case. But I guess it's it's a little surprising that it did come to an end so quickly,
mm, mm,
and and I'm not sure we've got the whole story yet about why it did come to an end, and why compromise could not be worked out with the Greens if going forward in a way that would have even allowed the minority government still to carry on.
mm,
So yeah, because in a sense, Nicola Sturgeon became and Alex Salmond both were relatively young when they became not
mm,
first minister but prominent within the party, and Hamza Yusuf is similar in terms of the political briefs that he's held, and
mm,
then becoming first minister. So in that sense, not dramatically different. But what is different is this breakdown, which again, you can see the ability of someone like Alex Salmond still to, despite the experiences and the accusations that have gone against him, how he's still able to maintain a political profile. And you can imagine if Nicola Sturgeon wanted to come back,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, it could certainly happen, but a lot will depend on the legal matters as well. But yeah, it's historians can keep out of predicting the future, so I don't know what's going to happen to Hamza Yusuf. But yes, it's historically I would say it's surprising that
Mm,
his leadership period of leadership ended so quickly.
mm, mm. So, like in terms of like, if I ask a historian, can they foresee future as well?
Oh, always get it wrong. That's why we like to look back. That's why being a sociologist, I liked historical evidence because I preferred my respondents to be already dead. They didn't have to argue back with my interpretation. So, but sadly, political scientists, well, not sadly, but of course, political scientists are dealing with people who are alive and willing and have their own views and have their own interpretation of your interpretation, and that's different. But I think we can see some of the structures that underpin political change. I think that's what historians can look at how those structures have influenced political ideology or political decision making in the past, and how that can still plays out. And we see, I started off by saying the influence of someone like Tom Nairn in the breakup of Britain
Mm,
book. There's still a generation of SNP leaders who see Tom sadly died not too long, relatively recently, but they're still so heavily influenced by that analysis and also debates around the union, the historical debates around the union are still very much informing some
mm,
of the kind of that more emotional response to politics today and independence today. So I think historians still have that job to play. I'm pretty convinced they still have that job to play in helping Scotland's people today to understand their past so they can better understand the kind of decisions they're looking to make going forward, whether that's with independent, whether it's a reformed parliament, or whether, even for those that argue against the parliament. I think all these positions need some form of historical understanding to help explain how we came to those decisions, and whether, the analysis that they were based on, whether that was mistaken or has been superseded by more recent events.
Just like one final question area, like, one of those, the future of Scotland, like lots of things are changing, like, in terms of climate politics, the economic system is also kind of struggling, the wars happening around the globe. So lots of things are actually happening around you. So like, I mean, how do you see like Scotland, where it's going towards? Like, even if you talk about outside politics in terms of prosperity or like economic well-being, where we are heading for?
One of the statistics that I always like to show the students is net emigration. If you take Scotland up to around about 2000, since we first started decent data on this since 1850 right through to around about 2000, Scotland's exporting people, it's losing people. Over the 20th century, it's about the only country in what was then the European Union that had flat or negative population growth over much of the over that 20th century period, and that's changed. So Scotland's now growing through immigration, and that's quite distinctive. And whether that's fewer people leaving, to some extent, yes, but also more people coming into Scotland. So there is that shift in the size of the population, but also in the demographic mix that's happening there as well. So I think that is going to play out over the years ahead as as it were, the age profile and the complexity of the racial makeup of Scotland's population changes, as well as the decline of previously dominant institutions like religious adherence, for example, is going down, and you see even things like kids today who are growing up knowing nothing but an SNP government, never knowing these other parties were in power. So there's that age that demographic change. I think is going to make changes in Scotland's economy, society, and political views, as well as these bigger political issues. I think the green agenda is going to keep on, and it's going to the environmental issues. You see that in a change away from reliance on oil and gas. I think those changes move towards renewable energies. These things are all going to move forward. I know there's a slight blip at the moment in the delivery of electric cars or the demand for electric cars, but I think that's movement away from reliance on importing these fossil fuels. I think that's going to have a big change as well. So the demographic, the sort of issues of environment, I think those are still big issues. Hence why I wonder how future historians are going to evaluate Hamza Yousaf's breakup with the Greens, because I think in some sense it seems the wrong time to do that.
Yeah. Because I think like one of the things I think the contentious issue was this net carbon target like by 2045.
Yeah, and I think it's just the ambition of it. I think, in one sense, you need to be ambitious to get anywhere along the roads. That's fine, but you got to be prepared to miss the target, because it was just, I think, consensus is that it was just too ambitious. So it's where you are. You can imagine if you're in the Green Party, that's exactly you want to keep that ambition there. But there's so many targets that are like that. It's no, again, one surprised that a compromise way forward couldn't be found on that.
So like coming back to your personal, life, your research and other things, what kind of things you are working on at the moment?
Oh, Actually, the environmental issue is coming back to me now, in that I'm now looking. I've recently finished a book looking at environmental reasons for emigration, so reasons of climate variation across Scotland that either can be associated with the movement of people. Now we're seeing climate emergencies across the world, people moving out of periods of blight or flood or drought. So we see a lot of world movement, but historically as well, there's strong evidence that Scots were both for environmental reasons, whether it's agricultural or whether even air quality in the urban environment. There are strong environmental reasons for people to relocate, plus all the environmental attraction of other parts of the world. So I'm interested in looking at the impact of those sort of environmental factors on behaviour, both in terms of emigration, but also in some of the statistics that we use, the kind of the social construction of statistics, how in the 19th century, environmental determinism, climate determinism was used to construct many of the statistics we still rely on. But we've kind of forgotten that environmental factors were being considered in the 19th century when we had the first vital statistics of Scotland being developed. So I'm interested in looking at the historical presence of environmental arguments and I guess asking the question why we don't use that evidence for what it was, which was environmentally underlying environmental issues were underlying the construction of that evidence. So it must have value for us to look back at that evidence to see what it can tell us today. So I think the environmental issue is something that historians are increasingly looking at. There's been a couple of conferences on that quite recently. There's a new special issue coming out of the main journal, Scottish Historical Review, that are going to look at how historians are reconfiguring the questions that they're asking because of a greater understanding of environmental matters. So I'm certainly moving in that direction, and that involves issues of emigration, leaving Scotland. Are all very much part of Scottish nationalism and understanding the Scottish nation. Right through to the 1920s, we thought people leaving Scotland wasn't such a bad thing. That's a very crude generalisation, but the SNP only turned against emigration in the 1920s until they thought this is draining us of a strong population. So I'm interested in those environmental issues that might have helped contributed to that drain of population, but now elsewhere in the world are contributing to the growth of population in Scotland as well. So that the environmental impact on movement of people is something that we've only looked at usually in terms of crisis and major catastrophe. Actually, the pernicious and developing impact of climate change, which was present in earlier periods, how that impacts on the movement of people. So that's what I'm looking at now, and always framing it in terms of Scotland, the nation, and what it might mean for Scotland as a political nation.
Like one final question is like, I mean, for the students, like what will be your advice if someone wants to do something on Scottish politics? Because Scottish politics is one of those area. Like for example, like in our department of politics, international relations, we always struggle to find a Scottish scholar.
Yeah, it's interesting because sort of, I guess the period I was developing my academic career, it was there were a lot of them. When I worked at Edinburgh University in those days, and we had strong sociology groupings that looked at Scottish politics. We had social policy. We had even ecclesiastical history, and as well as social work as well. So all the different social sciences were interested in some form of evidence associated with Scottish politics. So obviously that's not quite the case now, but there's still a strong interest. I had the joy of supervising a dissertation student this summer who's looking at how the SNP has changed over time in its policy towards Europe. So when it moved from kind of being hostile to Europe through looking really from the 60s and 70s right through to the early 2000s, looking at the change in on why the SNP changed its policy towards Europe. So there's still an interest there, and this particular student still went off to the National Archives of Scotland to go and find all the campaigning paraphernalia of the SNP. So, you know, I always get some dissertation students who are interested in studying Scottish politics and the Scottish nation. I have a PhD student at the moment who's working on the Scottish heritage industry, for example, and the relationship between the heritage bodies and the Scottish government. So there's that tension or that interrelationship as well that remains worthy of study. So I think there is, I think there still is a strong interest in how Scottish politics is going to develop. It's no longer just the example to compare alongside the Basque country of Catalonia, for example, or Quebec. I think the complexity that we've now seen in the history of Scottish nationalism is one that can, feature or can be compared with lots of different political entities and countries across the world. So I think there is a lot of comparative work that can be done there. So I remain optimistic.
So one final question is like, it's like some kind of fictional kind of setting. So you are arranging this like historical dinner, and then you are asked to bring not like even historian, that kind of thing, like more about historical figure rather.
Oh well, if we're going to bring a historical figure,
Yeah.
then I would always go back to dear old Sir William Wallace. He died in 1305, but his influence is still there. So a lot of my recent studies, or relatively recent studies, have looked at this historical figure because he lived a short life, maybe 30 odd years, hung, drawn, and quartered. But he died a kind of heroic death. And my interest in him is very much in someone who died in, as I say, 1305, but in the 19th century, they built more statues to William Wallace than to any other person in Scotland. There was a new statue to Wallace every decade over the 19th century, sometimes more than one. And we've got the National Wallace Monument there over the Abbey Craig in Stirling, which is there from 1856 onwards. So I would always bring Wallace because he's one of these figures that over time his afterlife has been so strong that he's been adopted by nationalists, by unionists, by radicals, by even his studies of or creative outputs have been done on Wallace's women, for example, all the women that supported him and helped him. So the realization that a lot of Scottish nationalism is very male dominated. So there's some realization that gender needs to get in there and an understanding of particularly of the female voice in Scottish nationalism. So I would go back to Wallace as being someone who would be interested to find out all the different ways that historians, political scientists, and others have used his memory to get his view on what people say about him. What way would he have voted? It was interesting that for Robert Burns, his biographer at the time of the 2014 referendum came out and said what way Robert Burns would have voted if he could at the referendum. So it'd be interesting to ask that question of Wallace as well. So I would put Wallace in there, put Burns in there as a guest, and I think just putting the pair of them together, just ask them about or to let them listen to the different ways that their afterlives have been discussed and wonder what they make of it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I still struggle because this Hollywood film, Braveheart.
Oh, Braveheart, yes.
What's it like? Okay, it's a quick question. Like, did you like that film? Did you watch that film?
Well, I did watch it, yes, and I'm not the biggest fan of historical epics, but I wrote a book on Wallace and included Braveheart in there, and I included Brave, the Disney cartoon that came a few years afterwards. And it's interesting how that film came about. So it's great fun showing
Mm.
all the historical inaccuracies of it. The most blatant being the Battle of Stirling Bridge taking place on land, no water, no bridge.
Oh my
There's
God.
some classics in there, but I also remember I was an advisor of studies in Edinburgh at the time when it came out, or first broadcast rather on the BBC, and I had students from England who were worried of their safety because they were being openly abused in the street. So it's interesting its kind of impact. But then when the premiere was held, you had the then Tory Secretary of State Michael Forsyth wearing the kilt, saying this is representative of the Tories and the successes that the Tories are bringing to Scotland. So it's great the way that it has been used politically, and I did for my sins turn up at the 10th anniversary screening in Stirling where they had a fans forum to celebrate all things to do with Braveheart, and they were going to have battle reenactments and everything. Although being in Scotland, of course, it rained and that had to be called off. But it's still influential. Even when I talk to my students today who weren't even born when it came out, they're still aware of it, and whether they learn about it at school or they watch it on Netflix or whatever, but they're still aware of it. And it's interesting how, going back to 2014, the idea of Wallace and the kind of that kind of dramatic language of freedom was downplayed by the SNP in 2014. And I think the Herald rather had done some investigations about how the kind of the strategists at the SNP said, well, let's not focus on that kind of blood and belonging kind of identity that Wallace represented. Let's instead focus on the kind of good governance of that who come from independence. So whereas in 1995, Alex Salmond was there. SNP sees a big increase in its membership. The attendance at the National Wallace Monument goes up from like about 20,000 a year in the early 19th century to about 1 million a year after Braveheart. It really transforms. So that kind of Braveheart language becomes dominant from 1995, but by 2014, there was definitely a conscious attempt within nationalist circles to downplay that kind of language. Whether it comes back again, I'm not sure, but you still see as votes on who are Scotland's greatest heroes. You still see Wallace up there, and I see the Stone Destiny is now back, and that has now got a new home, and so those historical symbols are still going to be important, I think, in the if there is another referendum in the not too distant future on Scottish independence.
Like, I mean, my side of the story about, William Wallace is I always feel like sad about this person. I feel like he's a tragic hero. Like, is he a tragic hero?
Well, in some ways, yes, but he also is a superhero, and he's not someone that is betrayed that loses or is killed by his own weakness or mistakes. He's only betrayed, so that gives he has so he's betrayed. He's been given a crown of thorns to wear. That kind of religious symbolism is part of it. But he's a lot of the early texts on Wallace and the poetry that was produced from the 17th century when it really took off in the 18th and 19th. A lot of that deals with him as a kind of almost like a killing machine. The 5 he killed before breakfast, the 5 he killed after lunch, and then killed 5 more, then sat down to have his dinner. He was this kind of heroic fighting machine who did it for the glory, selfless glory. Sometimes the glory is he does it for the love of his wife, even though he was never married. But that's some of the language that's used. Or he did it for the love of Scotland. He's inspired by a cloud formation where he sees a claymore in the sky, or he sees a cross of St Andrew in the cloud formation. So he's inspired by higher motives, and that's often the representation of Wallace. But, in terms of his life, it's a short-lived. He's successful with Stirling Bridge in 1297, defeated in 1298, and then disappears for a while before coming back, and eventually is betrayed in 1305, where he's then hung, drawn, and quartered. So a tragic end, but kind of the status of him and the memory of him is one of a self-made individual, a self-made man. So that's the kind of, certainly in the 19th century, where they venerate that kind of independence and industriousness and being able to be successful because of your own efforts. That kind of personal freedom is something that they celebrate in the 19th century, and that's part of why they argue, well, Wallace was this personal, heroic figure who, when followed by Robert the Bruce, gave Scotland its independence, and that independence remained until it was voluntarily given up in 1707 to join as equals with England in this new union. And that's what they were commemorating in the 19th century, is Wallace and Bruce and the battle and their battles and its results in Scotland's union with England, because that union was of equals. So even though Scotland was no longer an independent nation, it was independent within that union. That's what the Victorians were celebrating and commemorating of their memory of Wallace. So they saw him as a very heroic figure. But you're right, there's enough elements there that can see him as a tragic figure. And maybe the way he probably might see himself that way, if he thinks of all the different people who have tried to live off his afterlife and his memory for their own political purposes, whether it's class-based or nationalist based.
I'm just trying to promote like a Scottish tourism. I mean, what is the best place to like see like William Wallace, historical stuff?
Definitely go to Stirling. Go to Stirling and go to the National Wallace Monument. I think you'll see the monument there, but then also you see across the valley to Stirling Castle, and there's again you'll then see the statue of Bruce outside the castle. So seeing the two together, so definitely Stirling. I think there's if not Stirling, then go over to Ayr. I think there's three statues in two in Ayr town centre, one just outside. It's very much a lowland hero. The furthest north you get a statue to Wallace is in Aberdeen, but it's very much a hero of someone of lowland Scotland. So none of your Jacobitism, none of your kilts. This is a lowland hero. So between Ayr and Stirling would be where I would go, but certainly the National Wallace Monument it would be the starting place.
What's the closest statue you can see from Dundee? Is there any?
Dundee, well, closest is if you go to Dundee City Chambers.
Oh, they have. I never knew that.
Yeah, they've got stained glass windows commemorating Wallace in the city chambers. And Wallace supposedly went to school in Dundee, so the original Dundee High School has letters, and we have. I'm not sure if you're in the Scrimgeour building at this very you're not at this very moment, but the Scrimgeour family. There's letters between the Scrimgeour family and Wallace in terms of passing on land. So there are those Dundee links, but certainly through his education here. And but Longforgan as well. There's a small there's a marker there that you can see. So not too far outside Dundee, but actually in Dundee itself, the stained glass windows are the ones to go and see. So yeah, as I say, Wallace is very much a lowland hero and a lowland figure, and that's where you find all these statues, right really from east to west coast, but. Yeah, Aberdeen. For these purposes, Aberdeen, and for many other purposes, part of the lowlands in this regard.
So he's not a Highland hero.
No, not at all. No, there's lots of hills and wells and crevices that are named after him. So Elspeth King, who used to be the curator at this Smith Art Gallery and Museum in Stirling, she did a survey, and 50 or 60 of these geographical or geological sites are sort of have commemorative names to Wallace. But otherwise, there's more, as I say, there's all these statues, and then if you want Burns, of course, there's more. Burns has more statues than any other poet around the world. So there's loads of Burns statues, including obviously the one we have here in Dundee opposite the McManus Gallery, which is one of, it's one of three, and I think the best one to go and see is Central Park in New York. You can go and see almost identical statue to the one we have here in Dundee.
Okay. So thank you, Graham. I mean, I think I've learned so many things from you. I'm like
Oh,
more getting interested about William Wallace as well. I might need to come back because you wrote a book which kind of, talked about William Wallace.
yeah. So
So
Wallace is a great figure. So yeah, happy to talk more about Wallace. There's always things to say about Wallace.
thank you so much. I mean, so it's absolute privilege, so, but also, you are one of those, historians just live in a corner, no one knows. You are. So I thought, I'll just
Behind.
bring it back.
Yeah.
Public domain.
Well, well, we do lots of things. We do lots of things. A lot of what we do does have that public face to it, in terms of so many heritage sites around Scotland that history's always there. Can't be ignored.
Do you do any like field tour with the students?
I've not done tours for a while. I have done in the past, but when I taught in Edinburgh, it used to be so many monuments around Edinburgh in a short space of time. You could easily do a tour around there. But yeah, certainly one for Dundee could be interesting, because it's a really interesting city from its kind of medieval, early modern roots to this industrialization, and then what's happened since. So that kind of, Dundee and the Empire tour is an interesting one, and that's clearly, dealing with issues of slavery as well, which are around. So there's, yeah, when we're not overly stretched, that's something else to do.
Thank you.